Diversity and inclusion is a really important part of the work that CREST does, both in terms of the professionalisation of the industry, but also to make sure that it's open and accessible to the widest community we possibly can. Working within the technical security industry, we obviously have some individuals within that community that show certain signs in terms of moving towards the autistic spectrum. And what we try to do is to ensure that we have access to both that community, but also that we provide direct support for that community as well in terms of career opportunities. As part of our knowledge sharing, we established a set of different workshops where we pulled together people from the National Autism Society, people with diagnosed autism, and people from the penetration testing industry to see if we could identify a set of actions which would make the industry itself more inclusive and to ensure we have an appropriate level of diversity. We did this as part of our social responsibility activities and really looking at diversity and inclusion. We've done work with the National Crime Agency on intervention points to make sure that young people that have been socially isolated and potentially groomed into cybercrime have got an opportunity to move out of that into mainstream technology areas and into the industry itself. We've obviously looked at gender diversity, which seems to be on the lips of most people, which is absolutely correct. But in addition to that, we also wanted to make sure we're looking at elements of neurodiversity, initially starting with neurodiversity, initially started with autism. And therefore, we've produced a research document which is available both free and IPR free. The background to this was working with the National Autism Society that they wanted us to recognise that autism was a disability and it's something that we can actually diagnose and it's something that we can claim. And therefore what we've got is both people that are on the autistic scale that have notified and those that haven't. And what we wanted to do is to ensure that we understood how we could best support people in terms of moving into the industry itself. Disclosure of autism is not that common, but is increasing. But it does provide benefits to the potential employers and employees in terms of the support mechanisms that are available, and also it helps with the overall cycle in terms of the employment process. But what we wanted to do is to make sure that whatever we did would be applicable to those who also aren't diagnosed. Many of the individual attributes associated with autism are really things that we are interested in terms of technical security, that concentrating on detail, that tenacity in terms of trying to find a solution and an answer. All of those things are things that we actually value a great deal within our industry. And also I think we can provide direct support to help people in this environment. I think employers generally might not understand what autism is, and therefore they might also have some confusion in terms of autism as a single entity or elements associated with other forms of the disorder. And therefore what we wanted to do is to ensure that we recognise that and we could provide support mechanisms for the other aspects. Not everybody with autism is going to be suitable for our industry, and we completely recognise that. But for those that have a technical orientation, that are really interested in what we're doing, we wanted to ensure that we're open and inclusive, and we had the ability to actually include those people in our industry. In addition to that, there may be other issues that would make employment difficult, and therefore we need to recognise that. And there has to be other programs alongside that to make sure that those support mechanisms are in place for those other aspects. The industry therefore must ensure that it is inclusive. The industry, in actual fact, in this area is already quite diverse. In other words, there are people within the technical security industry that definitely are on the autistic spectrum, and therefore what we've done is we've tried to identify the really good things about our industry and provide them with opportunities for others to come in. And also we need to ensure that any activity we do define is going to fit within a wider diversity programme. The organisations that we represent should have a diversity programme, and it should cover all aspects of diversity, both educational background, neurodiversity and gender, and to ensure that we are open, inclusive, and we work very closely within the industry itself. There were two primary activities that we identified that we needed to consider. The first was, how do we educate employers? So in other words, how do we tell them about autism? How do we provide them with access to material? And how do we ensure that they have mechanisms in place to employ people in a structured way? Some people on the autistic spectrum certainly struggle with interviews. Some people on the autistic spectrum struggle with the concept of answering some of the more generic type questions that are asked, both in terms of interviews and application forms. And what we wanted to be able to do is to educate the employers to try to be more open to this type of community. There are two reports, one in particular from IAC, which I really like, that looks at that, and also there is another one from ACAS as well, which describes that. So the concentration of the CREST work was really how do we support the individuals and who may have an interest in cybersecurity, and how do we support them into the industry and then make sure they have the ability to stay with the relevant support structures. So these reports we've got here in terms of IAC and the CREST reports are both complementary, and they both describe activities that the industry should do to try to help. In terms of the technical security industry, we have a skill shortage. I think that goes without saying. And therefore, we have to open our doors to as many people as we possibly can. And again, if you look at the people with autism, then we actually value some of those attributes in our particular industry, as I've already described. And therefore, if we can market more effectively to that community, we'll have more people coming in. The industry itself already employs people, either formally or informally on the autism scale. And therefore, we must be able to do this. But what we need to be able to do is to think about how to do it in a structured way and do it on scale. We also need to ensure that people understand that our community exists and our industry exists. That's hard enough in the normal communities, going through schools and university systems. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that we market appropriately to the people we'd like to attract. And therefore, our marketing literature and our support must provide support in those sorts of areas, and it needs to be written in a way that's easily accessible and understandable by those individuals. And what we need to do is to make sure that people feel valued and make sure that they understand that attributes they bring to the community are of great value to us. And really, we would like them to come in and we'd like to build within our community. And therefore, what we need to do is to make available information about jobs, job opportunities, and how people can move forward. We ran a series of workshops and we came out with 5 predominant areas focused around the direct support to the individual. Being valued and recognised in terms of their positive attributes was the first. Knowledge of the opportunities, in other words, knowing that there is a community here that's interesting. Supported in terms of the application process, because as I say, sometimes that can be a difficult thing for people to understand. Supporting the working environment to make sure that if we actually bring somebody into the industry, we don't then lose them very quickly because they can't work within the environment itself. And also support with the interview process that actually ties those two things together in terms of the application process moving into working through the interview process itself. If you look at being valued and recognising the positive attributes, what we need to do is get positive messaging out there. There are activities that we can do in terms of the cybersecurity challenge which are open to lots of people, and therefore we start to raise the profile that this is of interest. That also helps because it's things you can put on your CV in terms of positive things that you've done to demonstrate an interest in the industry, and not necessarily just having academic qualifications or existing working environments. There's also the messaging that we need to make sure that we're doing appropriate messaging from our industry to describe it in a way that's fully understood. And I think we can do some short films in terms of the positive attributes and the reason why we're interested. And really that's the reason for making this particular film itself. In addition to that, I think we have the ability to interview people and also to describe what their working environment is like and why the industry is good. And therefore, if we can identify industry individuals as role models, we can interview them, then again we can provide that support at scale because all of that information will be available via the internet. In terms of the knowledge of the opportunities, again, I think the day in the life videos help, but also the collective view from internal and external recruiters, I think is also very important. The recruiters really act as a focal point between the potential employers and the employers themselves. And therefore, if we can do more in terms of identifying certain things that the recruiters can do to make sure they're attracting the right audience, then I believe that's a very positive thing we can do. And again, what we could do is we could arrange workshops and other activities to actually move the process forward. In terms of support to the application process, there was really interesting observations made by both the National Autism Society and some of the people with autism that came to our workshops in terms of not being able to understand the open questions that are asked in certain of the application processes and not fully understanding the application process in its own right. There's a whole raft of different activities that we think we can do in those areas. I don't think it's possible for us to change all of the application processes for every single organisation. And therefore, I think this orientation at this part of the work is to try and explain to people with autism about how to work within the existing application process. I think the work that's been done by ACAS and I think some of the work that's been done by IAC would certainly help from the employer's perspective, but I think it's incumbent on us to try to persuade the individuals that they have some responsibility in this and they should understand the process and get a relevant support both through mentoring, support and in terms of careers advice and guidance. In terms of support for the interview process, again, we believe that the employers should be doing more to actually facilitate having a more diverse workforce, and therefore the interview process should be orientated towards it. Again, the ACAS report on this, I think, describes that extremely well. But in saying that, there's still support mechanisms and support things that the individuals can do to help them in that environment. They can go early. They can ask that they have access to the rooms and the facilities so it's more familiar and less intimidating. They can ask for predefined sets of questions, and they can also make sure that they provide details of their syndrome to the people that are interviewing them so they fully understand both the issues associated with it but also the positive attributes that they're going to bring. And therefore it may not be a traditional application or interview process, but in that context, in actual fact, what we're trying to do is to employ people with very special skills, very special attributes, and many of those we can bring to bear. In terms of supporting in the working environment, what we don't want to do is to do the effort and take the risk potentially of taking people on and then lose them very quickly because they can't work. The concept of having a defined mentor that fully understands the issues associated with somebody's particular level of autism is extremely important. In other words, you have somebody to go to. I believe as an industry we should be providing a helpline where we can actually provide advice and guidance to those people that are having issues in the workforce, and therefore we can actually start to move the process forward of making these things better. So in other words, we can take all sorts of details and make sure that the working environment is set, making sure the lighting, the sound and those sorts of things as individual requirements are in place, making sure the people they work for and work with understand what the syndrome is and make sure they're sympathetic to their needs and making sure they can integrate into the environment. We're seeing some organisations just employing people with autism. Now, whether that's positive discrimination, I'm not too sure, but definitely there is some attributes there that are of interest. And we're also seeing some really good quality, particularly boutique organisations that are actually orientating all of their processes around making sure they're open and diverse. And then we're seeing large organisations trying to build this in as part of their diversity programme. But again, the individual has to take responsibility for ensuring that they can move the process forward. Our target audience for our report is autistic individuals, but also for parents, carers of autistic individuals. It is a difficult thing sometimes for people to understand, and therefore what we want to do is also point those positive attributes to the people, the carers and the careers advisors to make sure that they fully understand that this is a real benefit to some communities and we're really interested in taking these people on. School governors, school academics and also the relevant institutions are also people I think we need to educate. And again, the more vocal we have and the more, I believe, sort of pioneers and the people that are willing to stand up and talk about some of the issues they have and how we can make things better, all of those things I think are related to identifying the opportunities and making sure the target audiences fully understand what we're trying to achieve and understand what the positive elements are. In addition to that, we can also look for more mature individuals. So not everybody is diagnosed. The diagnosis is fairly new, but what we need to do is whatever we write needs to be appropriate for people that haven't been diagnosed but are already in the workforce or are struggling to get into the workforce. Therefore, we mustn't only concentrate on people that have been diagnosed, but also those that have certain attributes. And therefore, we need to make sure that anything we do is written in an appropriate way, it's not written in a disrespectful way, and it's not written in an isolating way. My preference would be that we write things that are appropriate for all communities rather than we write things specifically for a community. Thank you very much.